the first of 7 lessons. We've got 14 lessons that cover the entire spectrum of the Scriptures, which definitely makes this a survey class rather than getting in deep in any one area. One of the C's of the story of God. Do you remember the 5 C's? Can we name them? Creation, covenant, Christ, church, consummation. That's the story of God. It's important that all 5 of those get a moment in our study. So remember those 5 C's. Every single one, including Christ, including church, consummation, all get a place. Today we're starting the focus on the second C, which is covenant. Because content-wise in the Scriptures, that takes up the majority of the Bible. It's the most of the Old Testament. We need to spend 7 of our 14 Wednesdays covering that. Even if it's a survey, there's still so much information. So I've broken down the 7 covenantal movements over 7 different weeks. In fact, it's on. I have the syllabus printed for those of you who still haven't been able to grab one. There's one back on this back table. And so today we're looking at the first part of that covenantal period. And so it's important to remember in the story of God. And who's the main character in the Bible? God's the main character in the Bible. So in God's story that's being revealed through Scripture, we see the first thing God did was create the world boldly without our permission. We discussed that last week, didn't we? In the first account of creation, God used what to create the world? What part of Himself? His Word. The spoken Word has power to it. The second story of creation in Genesis chapter 2, what did He use physically? Yeah, He used His hands. He physically touched things to bring it to life. And so on both of those occasions, both of those accounts of the creation story, God acts swiftly without any of our permission. Okay? Jesus Christ is the third C. We're skipping over the second. On the third C, Jesus Christ is the Word made flesh and has moved into our neighborhood. God's Word came down to live with us, to speak for Himself. And like I said in our first meeting together, no one on earth leg wrestled God into doing that. Right? That was God's own doing. We had to sit back and watch. The whole world stood in awe of Jesus Christ. So we've got first, the third, and then the fifth one, the fifth C, is that God will recreate the world. It's called the consummation, particularly Revelation chapters 21 and 22. Those are great chapters in the Bible about the new heaven and the new earth, wiping away every tear from our eyes. That C also will be God acting and we're just watching. We don't get to participate much in the first, the third, and the fifth C of the story. Does that make sense? What's radically different about the second C, the covenantal time, is that God chooses to humble Himself in God's own wisdom, to humble Himself and partner with humans to carry out His story. It's kind of wild if you think about it. The first thing He did was act solely in His own will. And the second thing He does is humble Himself to partner with human beings. And so the covenantal period is wildly different than the creation period. And it takes place over a long period of time. God works through time instead of working outside of time. We discussed in our first time together, our first meeting in this room together, that God says, I'm the Alpha and the Omega. God Himself stands outside of time. Eternity, when we enter into eternity, we don't have endless time. We are stepping out of time. That makes sense? We're no longer affected by time. One of the curses of Adam and Eve was when they ate the fruit. They were now creatures of time. When you eat the fruit, you will die. Not immediately, but you will become mortal. You'll be affected by time. And so God has chosen in this second C to insert Himself into time, to work out in time. Okay? And that may answer a lot of our questions about why me, Lord, or why when we're dealing with this Syria or this issue in Syria and Iraq. Quicken the day, oh God. Act faster. Well, when God humbles Himself to work in time, it works out in time. It takes longer, rather than the swift nature of God's hand at work when He chooses to not acknowledge time. Okay? So we are We are inserting ourselves, we're walking through a period of the Scriptures, the period of God's story that is distinctly different than the creation time. It's distinctly different than the Christ era. It's the era of the covenant. So one of my questions is, what is the difference between a contract and a covenant? It's a big question. A contract versus a covenant.
Well, from a work point of view, covenant needs to come together, whereas a contract needs to drag together.
Okay. Come together versus drag together. I like that. On a contract, once the goal is met, the relationship's over. Right? You come together in a contract in order to achieve a goal, and once that goal's met, your relationship was based on that goal being met, right? How is that different than a covenant? Covenant's ongoing. I heard something in the back.
Continuous.
It's continuous. One way to say it is it's a relational-based agreement. Okay? It's a relational-based agreement. You probably heard me say, and it's a radical thing to say, I know, but at the table, when Jesus Christ said, "This is my," he raises up the cup and says, "This is the new." Sometimes I even say, "This is the new relationship that we have with God." It's a different way to say it, isn't it? Poured out in my blood for the forgiveness of sin. So when you enter into covenant with somebody, it's different than a contract in that it's relationally based. You're giving yourself to that person. They're giving themselves to you. What's a human covenant? What's the most basic human covenant? Marriage, right? And now they become one flesh. And so covenantal talk is a God-given thing. It was created by God through His wisdom to do something bigger than contracts or bigger than God working unilaterally in His own sovereignty. God chose to enter into a relationship with people, which is awfully frustrating for Him at times. Can you imagine? Okay. But He did it. And so God has started this thing called covenants. He locates people. He finds them. He makes promises to them. He works a relationship out with them, and He uses them for His good. The first person that starts this era between God and the world that He makes covenant with. Now we can look at Noah, and Noah is the first covenant, but I'm talking about a promise with expectations. The first covenant in that way was to a man named Abraham. Father Abraham had many sons. So God finds a man named Abraham, and what does God promise to Abraham? Okay. So Abraham will get to have people. He'll get to have a people. What else will he get to have? Land. What do we call that land? The promised land, right? So the land and a people were promised to Abraham. One of the things that you'll see, and I wrote this, the third point under Abraham, of the covenantal period, one of the things that's just a constant rhythm is that God makes promises to people that most certainly cannot at all take place, and they always do take place. Right? In the case of Abraham and Sarah, what was in the way? Age and barren. The scriptures in Romans describes, because Paul loves to quote Abraham, St. Paul, and he was saying that in the Greek, when Paul was writing this, he says, and Sarah's womb was as good as dead. Okay? God used something that was as good as dead to bring life. We've seen that before, haven't we? So throughout the Old Testament, throughout the covenantal period, what you'll see is God making bold promises. They're almost certainly not going to take place, and yet they always do take place. Okay? And so I'm going to continue to bring this up, and I want you to notice that rhythm, and I also want you to think about how that applies to your own life. So God seems to like tough odds. So Abraham was selected by God because of his righteousness. And these are some questions I'm going to have you just consider on your own time. But if you read your reading for this week, in order to survive and go through the land, did Abraham do some things that we would consider wrong? What were some of those things? He lied. How did he lie?
He lied about Sarah being his wife.
Right. Yeah, he said Sarah was his sister, not his wife. And so, who took a liking to Sarah? Do what? The king of the land. Do you remember what land that was? Yeah, I don't remember. They're wandering through land, and so Abraham saw if Sarah was believed to be his wife, which she was, then Abraham would be killed. And Abraham, in hindsight, we can say, was concerned about the fulfillment of the promise. And if his life was taken, so he lied. So several things happen in the Old Testament that's kind of a blemish, a black eye. King David, what was his major sin? Adultery with Bathsheba. And murder. Arranging the murder of Uriah. That's Bathsheba's husband. What about Esau and Jacob? Remember Esau and Jacob? They were twins, and
Jacob was cheated.
yeah, so Esau's the oldest brother, and Esau gets cheated out of his birthright by Jacob. Uh-oh, we're good. And he cheated him. He went to his dad when his dad was blind on his deathbed. He put fur on himself and said, I am Esau, right? So, yeah, his birthright was sold to him for a bunch of lentils for some reason, which was kind of a strange deal. But it wasn't sealed until Jacob went to Jacob went to his dad.
What is the significance of Jacob being born holding on to Esau's gift?
The struggle for being first. Yeah. So, real quickly, I'd like to point out those two things. One is that the promises seem like they're not going to be fulfilled, and they are. The second is that God somehow seems to use deceit, sin, our own greed, and yet his story still worked out. Now, raise your hand if that bothers you a little bit. It bothers me a lot bit, because I'm like the older brother on the story of the prodigal son. Right? Dad, why are you throwing him a big party? You've never thrown me and my buddies a party at all, and I've been here faithful to you, right? And so that's part of the struggle of the story of God. Part of the struggle of the Old Testament is that it is extremely dirty, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's gross. There's a lot of sin. There's genocide. There's wars. There's murders. There's assassinations. Go read Judges. A guy gets a tent spike taken through the side of his head. There's another guy who's in the bathroom, and he's really overweight, and he gets a sword thrust into him, and the folds of his fat take in the sheath of the sword. He can't pull it out, and he's found in the bathroom dead. That's in the Bible. It's in the Bible, And so the story of the Old Testament, the covenantal period, is messy, 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 and yet somehow throughout all of this, in God's humility, God humbles himself to partner with humankind, with in this case, the chosen people. They were chosen to enter into a covenant with him, and his story is brought out. It's a really radical idea. It flies in the face of the purity and the perfection of the story of God when God has to work with us, right? Our brokenness. So I put a little appendix with your study sheet today to help with the Holy Family, or the early covenantal family. So you've got this guy named Abraham, and he has several kids after he's been promised to have kids. The first one that's technically born is Ishmael to Abraham's slave girl. They were trying to fix the problem themselves of being barren. When Isaac was born, I'm sure you've heard the story, Ishmael was sent out with his mother out into the desert. God provided for them. The story follows on from Isaac. And so the scriptures tend to zero in on one of the branches of the family usually, instead of keeping track with everybody. And so the story then follows Isaac, because Isaac was actually the promised child between Sarah and Abraham. And Isaac, he has two sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau was born first. But Jacob, over his life, has tricked Esau and taken away his birthright. So then the story follows who? Esau or Jacob? It follows Jacob. See how this works? Just picks the next person. So So finally, Jacob, who's the son of Isaac and Rebekah, and that's the next one down, he ends up having 12 sons. There's a daughter in there too. See her, Dinah? Now, Jacob, when he is wandering in the desert one night, I forget the name of the river. It's Perez or Penez. And he's out there and he runs into, some say it was an angel, some say it was God himself, but he ends up having a fight all night with God, or this being of God. It says during the fight that his hip is dislocated. That's a euphemism. The actual Hebrew language is that he was his bathing suit parts were ruined. He got grabbed and practically castrated because of this fight. So it's extremely, again, Old Testament, messy, trust me. We like to say in church that his hip was dislocated so the preacher doesn't blush while he's preaching. So, although we don't bat an eye when we say circumcision, which is kind of funny if you think about Abraham when he's following God. You know, I'll follow you I'll leave everything I know and my home religion and follow you. And you want me to do what? So you have to remember he was an adult when that happened. So Abraham's grandson is Jacob, and he's out wrestling with this guy all night. He gets injured in the fight. In the morning, the sun's coming up, and apparently nighttime is when these things happen. And this being of God is trying to escape to get back to heaven, maybe to not be seen in the light. And what happens then? Do you remember? Yeah. So the tables have turned, and Jacob won't let go of this being, this angelic being, or a God. And again, it's unclear who it is. He won't let him go unless what? Unless you bless me first, then I'll let you go. And in that moment, Jacob's name was changed. What was it changed to? Israel. Right. Okay. So now you've got Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Who was Jacob? Okay. The promise has been passed down from generation to generation. This is another thing we're going to see. So the promise is now handed to Israel. Abraham is long gone. He's done his part. Israel has 12 sons, and we call them the 12 tribes of Israel. On the sheet that I provided for you, you might notice that Asher, Benjamin, Dan, Gad, Issachar, Joseph. Not Joseph. Joseph doesn't get his own tribe. It's kind of strange. You want to hear a weird technicality? Did you know have you heard that Israel's kids become the 12 tribes that settle the Holy Land? Well, the only one that doesn't get one is Joseph. And Joseph has 2 sons of his own. One was named Manasseh. Have you heard the word Manasseh before? The other was named Ephraim. And those 2 sons collectively make up the 12th tribe. And so it's a technicality when they say there were 12 tribes, because there's really 11 tribes and 2 halves or something. So, but you've got the 12, you've got the 11 original brothers to Joseph that are Jacob's sons. I'm giving you a lot of names here. And those end up being the holy tribes of Israel. So as the people grow and they grow and they grow, they can trace back their family to one of those sons. That makes sense? And the 12ness, the 12 becomes an important, like knowing your tribe becomes a really important tribal, I don't know, it's like I'm glad I'm an American, and I'm really glad I'm a Texan, you know? And so the people were glad to be part of the chosen folks, but they were especially glad to be of Judah, or of Benjamin, or of Dan. And so there's a lot of pride in between all these groups. So Jacob has these 12 sons. They grow up over time. As the story goes on, you'll see the word 12, 12, 12 in the scriptures tons. In the Old Testament, it's almost always referring to the 12 tribes of Israel. In the New Testament, Jesus had 12 disciples. In the book of Revelation, 12 and multiples of 12 are really important. 144,000 is used a lot. 1,200 is used a lot. You'll get the word 12 a whole lot. And that is an echo of what God has been doing through these 12 sons of Israel, of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. Okay. Is this all making sense? So this is the basic flow. is God has humbled himself, made a promise to a guy named Abraham, not for Abraham's sake, but for God's sake.